The screen door clapped shut and the deadbolt turned, and Carrie Tilly stood at the curb of Iron Street with two suitcases, a canvas duffel, $31, and a manila envelope she didn't yet understand, while her stepfather's porch light went dark behind her. None of them knew it yet, but the worthless thing they had just laughed her out of the family with was about to be worth more than everything they had spent the week dividing up. The condemned little bakery on Main Street. $14,000 of crumbling brick, the lawyer had called it. The junk, her uncle had called it. And under its floor, set deep in the mortar by a woman the whole town thought had nothing, was the answer to a question Carrie hadn't even learned to ask yet. But that was later. Right now there was just the curb, and a rain coming on cold and fine, and a porch gone dark behind her. She didn't bang on the door. People who have already lost don't bang on doors. Roy Pruitt had said his piece on the way out anyway, while he set her bags on the step. The Mercer money was supposed to come to this house, he'd told her, not even angry, just done. Instead, they hand you a pile of bricks the county won't let you stand in. So go on. Go sleep in your inheritance. Then the screen door, and the bolt, and the light. Carrie crouched on the cracked walk and opened the top suitcase. Somewhere in the rush of being put out, she had jammed Opal's blue mixing bowl in sideways, and the rim was riding up against the lid. The bowl was chipped at the lip and crazed all over with 40 years of use. She lifted it out with both hands and set it down on the bottom step, gentle as setting down a sleeping child, so the concrete and the cold wouldn't crack it. Then she shut the case. A girl with $31 does not get to replace what breaks. She was 20 years old, and she had been taking care of herself a long while before anybody made it official. She could stretch one tank of gas clear across 2 counties. She could turn day-old bread and a can of beans into 3 nights of suppers and never say a word about it. What she could not do, standing there in the dark, was make a man leave a porch light on. She had quit trying for that 1 year's back. The envelope she pushed inside her coat flat against her chest without opening it. It was the only thing the lawyer had slid across the table that her uncle hadn't tried to grab. Maybe that was why she held it, like it counted for something. She had no idea yet how much. It had all started that morning, in a cold room on Court Street, with the sound of grown people laughing. The lawyer's name was Renner, and his office smelled of burnt coffee and copier toner. Carrie sat in the hard chair by the door, the one nobody fights over. Dale and Brenda Mercer took the 2 good chairs up front, the way they took most things, like the seats already had their names burned into them. Renner read it out flat, the way a man reads other people's grief when it's just his Tuesday. The house on Sheffy Street, and all bank accounts to the nephew, Dale Mercer. Brenda's hand found Dale's forearm and squeezed. She was already gone from that room, Carrie could tell. Already standing on a dock at the lake house she'd been talking up for a month. Then Renner turned the page. To my great-niece Caroline Tilly, he read, I leave the property known as Mercer's Bakery on Main Street condemned, together with everything the building holds. For 1 second the room held still. Then Dale laughed. It came up out of him easy, like he'd been sitting on it. The bakery. He said it the way you'd say a curse word in church. She left the girl the bakery. Is that the one down by the old depot? Brenda asked, and she was smiling now too, warming to it. The one the county padlocked? Nobody's been allowed in there in years. $14,000 of brick, Renner said, reading the figure straight off the appraisal sheet. Condemned in 1998. No offers on record. He didn't say it to be cruel. He said it because it was printed there in front of him. Sometimes the hardest thing in a room is just a true one. Well, there it is, Dale said, and he looked over at Carrie for the first time all morning, the way you'd look at a stray that followed you home from the store. She gets the junk. Now, Dale Mercer had not set foot in his Aunt Opal's house in 9 years. He had not carried up her groceries or fixed her sagging gutter, or sat through one single Sunday of her company. But he knew her bank balance to the dollar. Some men only show up for the reading. Carrie didn't say anything. There was nothing she could have set down in that room that would have landed soft. She had spent every Sunday for 6 years walking clear across Marion to that bakery, the blue bowl tucked under her arm, reading the church bulletin out loud to a half-deaf old woman, because not one other branch of the family tree could be troubled to do it. Dale didn't know that. Dale thought Sundays were free. So when the laughing wore itself out, Carrie reached across the table and took the only thing being offered, the envelope, and the key, an old brass key on a loop of kitchen string that Renner pushed across last, like an afterthought he was glad to be rid of. "You'll want to change the locks," Renner said. "Or don't. Nothing in there worth stealing." He believed that. Every soul in that room believed it. Opal Mercer had spent 40 years making sure they would. By 9 that night, her stepfather had come around to the very same verdict the will had, and Carrie was standing on the Iron Street curb with everything she owned at her feet. So she did the only thing left to do. She picked up the suitcases, settled the duffel on her shoulder, cradled the blue bowl against her ribs, and started walking toward Maine. It was 11 blocks. The rain found her by the third one, soft and patient, the kind that knows it has all night and doesn't need to hurry. Marion went past her, dark and shut, storefront after storefront with the lights long out. The Norfolk and Western Depot leaned over the tracks at the bottom of the hill, the way it always had, an old building that had missed its last train by 40 years and never quite gotten over it. Route 11 ran on past all of it, 4 lanes of headed somewhere else. The bakery sat where it had always sat, dark between Cooley's diner, shut up since the mill closed, and the old 5 and dime with the windows soaked white. The whole block was the Mercer corner, folks said, though there hadn't been a Mercer behind that counter in a long, long time. Carrie stood out front in the rain and looked at it. Hers, the one thing on God's earth that was hers. The key stuck in the lock, then gave. The door swung in on a smell that stopped her cold on the threshold. Flour, old flour, and cold sugar, and a thread of machine oil, and underneath all of it something like cinnamon that had soaked so deep into the plaster that 30 empty years couldn't pull it out. It smelled like every Sunday she had ever spent that was worth a thing. She found a switch by feel. One bulb came up over the front counter, weak and yellow and buzzing. The glass cases stood empty, filmed grey with dust. The big floor mixer was still bolted to its bench, its bowl gone dull. A paper calendar hung crooked by the back door, stopped on a month nobody had bothered to turn, and on a hook beside it hung an apron, faded blue, the string still tied in the loose bow of a woman who meant to be back in a minute. Carrie touched it and didn't let herself think about it. The floor was old brick, laid in a herringbone, worn glass smooth and dipped into a shallow path that ran from the door to the ovens, where the cold black mouths of them stood against the back wall. Somebody had walked that path 10,000 times. The register drawer hung open an inch and stuck there, jammed on the same swollen corner it had surely jammed on for 30 years, faithful in the small, annoying way old things sometimes are. She was too tired to be afraid. She spread her coat in the corner by the cold ovens, where the brick still seemed to hold a little warmth. Or she told herself it did, which came to the same thing that night. She lay down with the blue bowl set careful beside her, and the brass key still on its string at her throat, and the unopened envelope flat against her chest where her heart was. She shifted, hunting a place to settle her hip against the hard floor, and her boot heel knocked a brick that moved. Just the one. It rocked in its bed, loose, tipping under her foot with a small dry click, the way a baby tooth rocks when it's nearly ready to come out. Carrie was already half under. She pressed it flat with her heel and thought nothing more of it. A loose brick in a 100-year-old floor. Of course there was a loose brick. There's always one. She had no way of knowing that her great-aunt had paid a good man honest money, more than 40 years back, to lay that whole floor true and tight, and leave that single brick exactly that loose. Outside, the rain came down steady, on the Mercer corner. Inside, Carrie Tilley slept on the only thing in the world that belonged to her. One hand over an envelope she still hadn't found the heart to open, and 6 inches under her heel, set in the mortar where it had been waiting since before she was born, a flat steel box held its breath in the dark. Morning came up grey and wet through the soaked glass, and for a long moment Carrie did not know where she was. Then the smell told her. Flour and cold sugar, and that thread of cinnamon worked so deep into the plaster that no amount of empty years could lift it, and the brick gone hard under her hip in the night, and the blue bowl sitting beside her head, right where she'd left it. She lay still and let the ceiling swim up into focus. The old pressed tin of it, square after square. A water stain spread brown across one corner, in the shape of no country on God's earth. Somewhere overhead a pipe ticked once and went quiet. Out on Main Street a truck rolled by slow through the standing water, and then the silence came back down over everything. The deep kind of silence that belongs to a town that has quit expecting much. She sat up. Her breath smoked a little in the cold. The one bulb over the front counter had burned all night, weak and yellow and faithful, and she reached up and shut it off, because a girl with $31 does not pay good light to shine on an empty room in the daytime, even if the light isn't rightly hers to pay for yet. A habit like that doesn't stop to ask whose name is on the bill. She took stock the way she always did first thing, before anything could get a jump on her. $31, still folded in the inside pocket of her coat where her hand had kept it warm all night. A 20 and a 10, and one lonesome single. Half a sleeve of crackers in the duffel. A jar of peanut butter she'd had the sense to grab off Roy Pruitt's shelf on her way out the door, which she figured she'd earned, having bought it herself in the first place. 3 nights of suppers in that. Maybe 4 if she went careful. And she always went careful. She could make a little stretch a long way. She'd been doing it since she was old enough to count change at a counter and watch the cashier's face to see if she'd done it right. What she could not do was sit on that floor all morning. A body that sits still in the cold starts to believe the cold is the whole world. So she stood, and she folded her coat, and she set the blue bowl up on the front counter, where the dust was. Up where she could see it, like putting out one familiar face in a room full of strangers. And she went out into the morning to find a cup of coffee she probably shouldn't buy. Main Street looked the way it had looked the night before, only worse for the daylight. Cooley's diner sat dark and padlocked next door, a yellowed sign in the glass still promising a breakfast special that hadn't been served since the mill let its last shift go. The 5 and dime on the other side wore its soaked windows like cataracts. Down the hill, the old Norfolk and Western Depot leaned over the tracks the way it always had, patient and useless. And past all of it, Route 11 ran its 4 lanes of people on their way to somewhere that wasn't Marion. The rain had quit in the night and left the whole street washed and gleaming and nobody on it. There was a little gas station 2 blocks up that kept a coffee pot going, and Carrie bought 1 cup, black, 85 cents, and she felt every penny of it leave her hand. Then she carried it back down Main because she did not want to drink it in there, under the fluorescent lights with a stranger watching, and she sat down on the bus bench across from the bakery. The green metal one bolted to the sidewalk with an advertisement for a funeral home faded near to nothing on its back. And she held the warm cup in both hands and looked at the building that was hers. That was when she finally opened the envelope. She'd carried it flat against her chest for 14 hours and not looked once. The way you'll leave a wrapped thing wrapped, because as long as it's closed it could be anything. Now she worked her thumb under the flap and tore it slow, careful, like there might be something inside that didn't take well to being hurried. There was 1 sheet of paper, folded in 3, and the second her eyes hit the handwriting, she had to set the coffee down on the bench beside her because her hands were not going to be steady enough to hold it. She knew that hand. She'd known it her whole life, off the backs of birthday cards and the labels on jam jars, and the little notes Opal used to leave tucked in the church bulletin when her eyes got too bad to read it herself. The letters leaned hard to the right, the way they teach you in a one-room school, every one of them put down slow and deliberate by a woman who believed paper deserved your full attention, or none of it. Caroline, it began. Not Carrie. Caroline. Opal was the only soul alive who'd called her by the whole of her name, and reading it there in that crooked, careful hand was like hearing the old woman say it out loud. One more time, from a long way off. Carrie read it twice through before she could take it in. Caroline, if you are reading this, then I am gone on, and they have read you the will, and I expect by now somebody has had a good laugh at what I left you. Let them laugh, child. A laugh is a cheap thing, and they have always bought cheap. I know what they think of that little bakery. I made sure they would think it. I spent the better part of my life making sure of it, and it cost me more than you will ever know to let people believe I had nothing. But it was the only way I could think of to keep what's mine out of the hands that would only have spent it. So listen to me now the way you used to listen on Sundays. I didn't leave you the bakery, child. I left you what's under it. Count the floor, not the days. You were the only one who ever came. You never once came for the counting. That is the whole reason. Love, your Opal. Carrie sat very still on that green bench with the paper shaking in her fingers and the coffee going cold beside her, and she read that one line again. I left you what's under it. Count the floor, not the days. She did not understand it. She turned the page over thinking there'd be more on the back, some plain word that made it make sense, but the back was empty. Under it, count the floor. It sounded like the kind of thing an old mind says toward the end, when the words come loose from their meanings and float a little. She'd seen that happen to Opal some, near the last. She folded the letter back along its creases, slow, and pressed it flat. And she did not let herself cry on a public bench on Main Street, where the whole of Marion could drive by and see Opal Mercer's girl come apart. She had quit crying where people could watch a long time ago. That was a thing you learned in Roy Pruitt's house, or you didn't learn anything. It was while she was sitting there getting her face back under her that somebody lifted a hand to her from across the street. He was an old man, stout and slow-moving, in a canvas coat gone soft with age, and a feed store cap, standing in front of the shut-up hardware on the far side of Main with a paper sack of his own in one hand. He'd stopped dead on the sidewalk the way a man stops when something he's looking at doesn't fit, and he was looking at her, and then at the bakery behind her, and then back at her. And he raised his free hand, not waving exactly, more like a man making sure of something, and he called across the empty street in a voice worn rough as a rasp. "You'd be Opal's girl." Carrie stood up. "Yes, sir." "The Sunday one." He said it like it settled an old argument he'd had with himself. He came across the street towards her, unhurried, watching where he put his feet on the wet pavement, and up close his face was a map of deep weather, and his eyes were a pale washed blue and kind. "I'd know you anywhere. You used to come up this street every Sunday of the world with a blue bowl under your arm and your church clothes on, walking like you had somewhere to be. Opal'd stand in that window there and watch for you." He nodded at the bakery's dark front glass, wouldn't let on. But she watched. Something in Carrie's chest pulled tight and hot. "I didn't know that," she managed. No, she wasn't one to let a soul know a thing she didn't have to. The old man shifted his sack to the other hand and put out a square hard palm, and she took it. And it was like shaking hands with a piece of the sidewalk. "Walt Sams. I knew your great-aunt 30 year more." He looked up past her at the building, up at the brick of it, and something moved across his face that she couldn't read. Something almost like a man recognizing his own handwriting in an old letter. "They give you this place, did they?" "They did." "Huh." Walt Sams looked at the bakery a good while. "Folks'll tell you it ain't worth the brick it stands in." Then he looked back down at her, and his washed blue eyes had gone careful and weighing, like he was standing at the edge of saying more than he meant to. "Folks don't always know what a thing's worth, especially not brick. I've laid enough of it to know there's more than one reason a man builds a thing the way he builds it." He stopped himself there. Whatever else was behind his teeth, he kept it. "You take care of yourself, Opal's girl. You need anything, I'm just up the road on Sheffy." He touched the bill of his cap and went on his slow way up Main, and Carrie stood on the sidewalk holding a cold cup of coffee and a folded letter she did not understand, watching him go, with the strangest feeling that she had just been told something important in a language she hadn't learned yet. She let herself back into the bakery and decided, since she had nothing else on this earth to do, and nowhere else on this earth to be, that she would at least clean it. It was the kind of decision a person makes to keep from making harder ones. But once she started, she couldn't stop, because the place answered to it. She found a broom behind the back door, the straw worn round on one side from Opal's own sweeping, and she swept 30 years of grey dust off the herringbone brick and out the front door into the street. She filled a bucket at the back sink, which groaned and spat rust and then ran clear, and she wiped down the glass cases until the glass remembered it was glass. She worked the swollen register drawer loose from the corner it had jammed on, and it slid open the rest of the way, with a little ring of its bell, empty as a promise, and she laughed out loud at it. One short, surprised sound in the quiet, the first one in days. She did not take down the blue apron from its hook by the door. She wasn't ready for that, but she worked around it, and once passing, she straightened the loose bow of its strings, without quite letting herself notice she'd done it. She slept there that night, and the next, and the one after. She bought a second-hand camp stove for $4 from a man selling things out of his garage on Sheffy Street, and she boiled water on it and ate her crackers and peanut butter and rationed the single light bulb, and she scrubbed a little more of the place back to itself each day. The town saw the front door propped open and the dust coming out and didn't quite know what to make of it. A face or two slowed at the glass. Nobody came in. There was nothing yet to come in for. And the whole time, day after day, her boot kept finding that one loose brick. It was over by the cold ovens, in the path worn smooth toward the back, and a body crossing the room naturally stepped right where it lay. Every time her heel came down on it, the thing rocked under her, that small dry click, tipping in its bed and settling back. She stepped on it carrying the bucket. She stepped on it with the broom. The fourth or fifth time it caught her, she stopped and stood over it with her hands on her hips and frowned down at it, the way you'd frown at a clock that keeps poor time. Half a mind to do something about it and half a mind to leave well enough alone. A loose brick in a 100-year-old floor. She told herself that the first night, and she told herself again now. Every old floor's got one. But Opal's voice was in her coat pocket, folded in 3. I left you what's under it. Count the floor, not the days. Carrie stood there in the long quiet of the place with the evening coming grey-blue through the front glass, and she looked down at that one brick that would not hold still under her. And for the first time, the old woman's words stopped floating loose and settled, slow, into a shape that made a terrible kind of sense. Count the floor. She got down on her knees. The brick was the colour of dried blood, the way all of them were, worn down at the centre where 40 years of feet had crossed to the ovens and back. She knelt over it with the evening light going to slate behind her, and she put 2 fingers to its edge. Gentle, the way you'd touch a sawtooth to find out just how bad. It rocked. That same small dry click it had been giving her all week, only now she was down at its level to hear it, and from down there it didn't sound like a fault in an old floor. It sounded like a thing answering when its name is called. She tried to get a fingernail into the seam around it and couldn't. The mortar there had gone soft and grey and crumbled, but the gap was too tight for a finger, and she sat back on her heels and looked at it a while. Then she got up and went to the back, and found in the drawer under the dead sink where Opal had kept her odd iron, a flat-bladed putty knife with a cracked wood handle, spotted with old paint. She came back and knelt again and slid the blade down along the long edge of the brick, working it the way you'd ease a pie out of a tin. You'd let cool too long. Patient. A little at one corner, and then a little at the other, and the soft mortar gave up around it in dry pale crumbs that she brushed aside with the flat of her hand. The brick lifted. It came up slow and heavy and wrong, heavier than a brick has any business being, and her breath caught somewhere up under her collarbone, because a brick that's just a brick comes up light and gritty and tells you nothing. This one came up like it was attached to the whole weight of the world underneath it. She set it aside on the swept floor, careful, the way Walt would later tell her his own mason father had taught him to set down a stone you mean to lay again. And she looked down into the hole where it had been. It was not a hole. It was a nest, set down into the mortar bed, flush with the underside where the brick had ridden on it all these years was a lid of flat steel. Grey, pitted along one edge with a faint blistering of rust, but solid. A made thing, a thing with corners and a purpose. Somebody had cut a pocket down into the floor of that bakery and set a steel box into it and packed the mortar back in around the lid, and then laid one brick over the top, so smooth and so deliberate that for 40 years a whole town had walked across it and called it ruined. Carrie did not move for a moment. Out front, a car went by on Main and threw a slow wash of headlight across the soaped glass and was gone. And the room went back to slate, and she was alone with it. She got both hands down in there. The steel was cold, colder than the brick, cold the way a deep thing is cold, and her fingers found the edges of it, and there was a lip, a little raised rim where the box met the mortar. And she worked her fingertips under that and she pulled. It didn't want to come. 40 years had married it to the floor. She braced her knees and she set her jaw, and she pulled the way she'd learned to pull on things that didn't want to move, with her back and not just her arms, and something gave down in the mortar with a sound like a held breath letting go, and the box came up out of the floor and into her lap. It was about the size of a bread tin, only deeper, with a hinged lid and a little hasp that someone had once run a padlock through, and the padlock long gone to rust and fallen away. She sat there on the cold brick with it heavy across her thighs, and her own pulse going hard in her ears, and she thumbed the hasp back, and she lifted the lid. There was oilcloth on top, folded, the kind they used to line shelves with, gone yellow and brittle at the folds. She lifted it away. Under it, a key. Brass long as her finger, heavier than a house key, with a number stamped into the round of its head, and a little tag of cardstock tied to it with kitchen string. And on the tag, in that crooked, careful, right-leaning hand she'd have known in the dark, in the bottom of a coal mine, at the end of the world was written one word, and the word was her name. Caroline. Not Carrie. Caroline, the whole of it. The way only one soul, living or dead, had ever called her. Written out slow and sure by a woman who'd been planning. Who'd known. Who'd sat down here in this room at some hour. Carrie would never get to share and tied a string to a key and written a child's name on it and laid it in the dark to wait. That was the thing that finally undid her. Not the box, not the steel, not the strangeness of it, Her own name in Opal's hand, down there in the floor, where it had been waiting on her the whole time the rest of them were laughing. She pressed the back of her wrist hard against her mouth, and she let it come. Finally, the crying she'd held off on the bench and held off at the will, reading and held off every night on that floor, with her coat for a pillow. She let it come, because there was nobody to see it now, but the dark and the dead had earned the right. She cried the way you cry over a thing that's too late and too much, at once, kneeling on a brick floor, in a shut-up bakery in a town that had quit expecting much, with her dead great-aunt's name for her tied to a brass key in her hand. When it passed, and it did pass the way it does, she wiped her face on her sleeve and she looked at what else was in the box. A ledger, one of the old kind black pasteboard covers, gone furred at the corners, a red cloth spine, the pages inside ruled in faint blue and filled top to bottom, year on year, in that same hand getting older, as it went down the years, steadier at the front and shakier toward the back the way a life is. And tucked into the front of it, loose, a slip of paper. A deposit slip, water-stained along its bottom edge to a soft brown bloom, stamped at the top with the name of the bank up on Main, and printed down its middle with an account number. A long one, more digits than a checking account had any cause to carry, and not one thing else to say what it was for. Carrie sat with the ledger open across the steel box across her knees, and she could not, in the failing light, make sense of the half of what she saw. Dates down the left margin. Going back, she leaned close, going back to 1981. Small sums entered in the careful columns. And beside each one, not a name like you'd keep for a store account, but a word or two in Opal's shorthand that meant nothing to Carrie at all. Smith boy, shoes, widow on cherry, coal, clinic December. The fire truck, balance, hard winter. The Hales, hard winter. The Combs. Page after page of it, a small sum and a few plain words, 40 years deep. She did not understand it. She understood that she had to show it to somebody who might. There was only one somebody in the whole of Marion who'd looked at this building like it might be more than brick. Walt Sams kept a porch light on up on Sheffy Street, and when Carrie came up his walk in the dark with the steel box held against her chest in both arms, he was already standing in his open door, in his undershirt and his suspenders, looking out at the night the way old men do, who don't sleep much anymore. He saw what she was carrying before he saw her face. She watched him see it. She watched something go still and old and grieved come up in him, and he pushed the screen door wide without a word and stood back to let her in. She set it on his kitchen table under the hanging bulb. He stood over it a long moment with his big square hands flat on the oilcloth, and he did not touch it. Then he reached out and turned it a half-inch with one finger, just enough to square it to him, and he let out a long breath through his nose. So she did keep it, he said. All these years I told myself she'd have moved it, spent it, something. He shook his head slow. I should have known better. Opal never moved a thing she'd once set down where she wanted it. You know what this is. Carrie's voice came out thin. Mr. Sams, you know what this is. I know the hole it came out of. He pulled out a chair and sat down heavy, and he looked up at her, and his washed blue eyes were wet at the rims and not ashamed of it. I laid that floor, girl. Summer of '79. Herringbone every brick by hand. 2 weeks on my knees in that heat. He turned his hands over and looked at the palms of them, like the print of it might still be there. And one day along about the middle of it, your great-aunt comes and stands over me and she says, Walt, I want you to leave me a place. Right here. She marks it with her shoe. By the oven. A pocket, she says, the size of a bread tin, with a lid set flush, and one brick over it, loose enough a body can lift it, but tight enough a body would never think to. And don't you tell a living soul, Walt. Not now and not after. He looked at the box. I never asked her what for. You didn't ask Opal Mercer her business. I just built it the way she wanted it built, and I laid that one brick over the top, so pretty it like to broke my heart to make it look like nothing. And I took my pay, and I kept my mouth shut for 40-some years. His jaw worked. I'd see folks walk across it. Lawyer fella that came around when she passed walked right over it in his good shoes, calling the whole place a tear down. Walked right over it. He gave a short, rough sound that wasn't quite a laugh. I near told him. God help me. I held my tongue because I give her my word, and because I figured she'd left it for whoever was meant to find it. He looked up at Carrie. And here you are, the Sunday one, the blue bowl. He nodded, slow, like the last piece of a thing had come down into its place. Count the floor, not the days. That's what she used to say to me when I'd fret the job was running long. Count the floor, Walt. She'd say that to you too, in a letter. Carrie's throat was tight. I didn't know what she meant. You do now. Walt Sams reached out finally and laid one finger on the open ledger. Light the way you touch a sleeping child. What's all this then? Carrie turned it so the lamp fell on the pages, and she read him one of the lines, the December one, Clinic December, and the small sum beside it, and she watched the old man's face change. That clinic, he said slowly, the free clinic down on Strother, opened up the winter of, 86, when the mill cut its insurance. He put a thick finger on another line, the fire truck, balance, and he was quiet a moment. Town couldn't make the note on the new pumper in 91. It got paid off anonymous. Whole county talked about it for a month. Never knew who. He looked up at her, and his voice had gone very low. Girl. This whole town's been telling itself for 40 years it didn't have 2 nickels. And the whole time there was a broke old woman in a failing bakery, keeping the lights on for half of us in the dark. He sat back. She let everybody believe she had nothing. She worked at making them believe it. And it wasn't nothing she had at all. It was the opposite of nothing. Carrie looked down at the water-stained deposit slip in her hand, at the long account number printed across the middle of it, that no checking account had ever needed, and at the name of the bank stamped up at the top, the bank that sat not 4 blocks from where they were sitting, down on Main, with its lights off for the night, and she turned the brass key over in her other hand, the one with her own name tied to it, and she understood, the way you understand a thing all at once after staring at it a long time, that the box on Walt Sams's kitchen table was not the end of what Opal had left her under that floor. It was the key to it. Morning came up hard and bright over Marion, a clean and pitiless cold that lay along Main Street and turned every shut window to a sheet of white fire. And by 9 o'clock Carrie was standing on the sidewalk in front of the bank with the steel box wrapped in a flour sack under her arm and the brass key gone warm in her fist from the whole walk down. Walt Sam stood beside her in a church coat she had never once seen him wear, his white hair wet-combed flat, his hat in both hands. He had not let her come alone. When the young fellow inside came to throw the bolt and let the day's business in, Walt set his hat on his head and took it off again, and he said under his breath, "All right then, let's go see what your aunt did with her 40 years. The manager was a careful, quiet man who took the key from her across his desk and turned it over once, and read the number stamped in the head of it. And then he got up without a word and went to a low steel cabinet against the back wall and was a long time in it. When he came back he was holding a card gone soft and brown at the corners, and he laid it on the blotter and turned it so she could see. And he said, 'This box has been on our books since before I worked here. Rent was paid forward in a lump. A long way forward. Nobody's opened it in some years.' Carrie looked at the card. There were 2 lines of signature on it. The top one was Opal's, that right-leaning hand, younger and surer than the letter in Carrie's coat. And under it, in the round, wobbling print of a child who has been told to write her whole name and to take her time, was Carolyn Tilley. Carrie did not remember signing it. She had no memory at all of the day a great-aunt had walked her up to a desk in this bank and folded a child's hand around a pen, and that was somehow the worst and best of it, that there had been a whole plan moving around her when she was too small to know a plan from a Sunday, and she had put her own name to it and gone home for supper and never known. They went down into the vault together, Carrie and Walt and the manager turned his key, and she turned hers, and the long box slid out of the wall, heavier than the steel one had been. He carried it to a little room with a table and a single chair, and set it down and stepped out, and pulled the curtain, and left them to it. Walt stood back against the wall with his hat over his heart like he was at a graveside. Carrie lifted the lid. There was a banded brick of paper inside, fat as a Bible, and she took it out, and it was bonds, United States savings bonds, the old engraved kind, dozens of them, hundreds, dated down the years the same way the ledger ran, a few bought every season for 40 years, the small, steady buying of a woman who sold bread by the loaf and put the difference somewhere Dale Mercer would never think to look. Every one of them carried to its full term. Carrie did not know the arithmetic of it and didn't need to. Under the bonds was a stiff envelope, and in the envelope a folded document with a blue backing and, stamped across its face in faded purple, the seal and the deed book and the page number of the county clerk's office, over on Court Street, the mark that said this paper was not just written, but recorded, set down in the public books of Smith County for anyone with the wit to look. Carrie read it standing up, slow, her finger under the lines the way Opal had taught her to read a church bulletin so the words wouldn't run. It was a trust. It put the bakery and the lot it sat on, the whole of the Mercer corner, where Main met the side street, and every bond in that box, into the hand of one trustee for one beneficiary, and the names of both were the same name. Hers, the long Sunday one, Caroline. And the date down at the bottom where the clerk's stamp bit into the paper was 9 years gone. Walt let out a breath against the wall. Recorded, he said. She didn't hide it, girl. That's the thing of it. She didn't hide a one of these. She put it in the books in broad daylight and let the building rot out front so nobody would ever go and read them. He shook his head slow. The lawyer called this corner $14,000 of bad brick. Your uncle called it the junk, and it was sitting on more than the whole rest of what they tore the house apart fighting over. More than $300,000, paid for one loaf at a time, with both their names already spent on a lake house and a new truck. He looked at the bonds and then at her. They buried the money by calling it nothing, and she let them. She helped them believe it. The closing was set for Thursday at 4, in the lawyer's long office above the old 5 and dime, and Dale had sent word through the lawyer that Carrie was to come and bring the bakery deed and a pen, and not make a production of it. So she came. She came up the stairs with the steel box in the flour sack, and Walt Sams a step behind her, and she came into the same long room, with the same long table where, 3 weeks gone, she had sat with her hands in her lap, and listened to grown people laugh, while a clerk read out that the orphan got the condemned bakery. They were all of them there, Dale at the head with his collar tight, Brenda beside him with a folder of Lake House papers, already open in front of her, like the thing was done, the lawyer with his stacks squared, and down at the far end, a heavy, calm man in a good grey suit Carrie had never met, with a roll of block plans under his hand, the developer, Hollis Reed, who had the whole corner under contract and needed every last parcel of it to sign, or the deal was so much paper. Sit down, Caroline, Dale said, and he could not even be bothered to get the name right, said it the careless way. We'll have you out of here in 10 minutes. Sign where Ronnie marks it, and you can go on back to wherever you're staying. Carrie did not sit down. She lifted the flour sack and set the steel box on the table, square in the middle of all that squared paper, and the mortar dust still on it ran a little grey onto the polished wood, and the room got quiet the way a room does when a thing is set down that doesn't belong to the meeting anybody planned. Brenda's mouth opened. Dale looked at the box and looked at Walt standing by the door, and a thing moved behind his eyes that was not quite fear yet, but was kin to it. What in the world is that? The lawyer said. Carrie opened the lid and took out the document with the blue backing and the purple stamp, and she did not say a word about it. She just slid it down the long table the way you'd slide a plate to the far end, and it came to rest in front of the lawyer, and he picked it up out of habit, a man who picks up every paper, and he started to read it the bored way, and then he stopped being bored. Carrie watched him stop. She watched his eyes go back up to the top of the page, and start again, and his face go careful and then go pale around the mouth, and he set it down flat on the table, and put 2 fingers on it like it might get up. Dale, he said, and his voice had changed. Dale, this is a deed of trust. Recorded. Court Street deed book and page stamped. He looked up. It's dated 9 years back. It conveys the corner, the lot, the building, all of it, into trust. For her. That's not possible, Brenda said fast and high. That building came to her in the will. We all sat right here. That's our property under contract. That's Dale, tell him. The will doesn't matter, the lawyer said, and there was something almost like wonder in how flat he said it. If this was recorded 9 years ago, the corner was already out of Opal's estate before she ever died. It was never hers to leave anybody. It was already the girl's. The will gave away a bakery Opal didn't own anymore. She'd already given it to Caroline. Years ago. In the books. He turned the page over and read the back and turned it again. And it isn't just the building. Read it. It's the lot. The whole Mercer corner. It went very still then. Hollis Reed had not said one word the whole time, and now he reached across and turned the deed so he could read it himself. And he read it the way a man reads who has built his whole arithmetic on a thing being true, And then he sat back in his chair and let out a long, slow breath through his nose and began, without any heat at all, to roll up the block plans under his hand. "Mr. Reed," Dale said. "Hollis. This is a misunderstanding. We'll get it cleared up. The girl's 20 years old. She doesn't even. Your contract warranted clear title to every parcel on that block," Reed said, mild, sliding the roll of plans into the tube it had come from, and capping it. "You don't have title to the corner. By the look of that stamp, you never did. Without the corner, I don't have a block. Without a block, I don't have a project." He stood and buttoned his coat. "My lawyer will call your lawyer about the earnest money. I'd hang on to it if I were you. You're going to need it." And he picked up his tube of dead plans, and he walked the length of that long table and out the door, and they heard his shoes going down the stairs over the old 5 and dime, unhurried, a man already on to the next thing, and that was the sound of the whole deal leaving the building. It was Walt Sams who broke the quiet, from over by the door, gentle, almost kind. "Clark's office is open till 5, he said. "It's 2 blocks. Anybody that doubts that paper can walk over to Court Street right now and have them pull the book and read the date out loud." He looked at Dale a long moment. "I've known where every brick in that floor sat for 40 years, Dale. I always wondered what she put under the one I left loose. Turns out it was her whole answer to the both of you." He nodded toward Brenda's open folder, the Lake House papers, the earnest money written on a deal that had just walked down the stairs. "I'd close that. There's nothing in it now, and there was not. The clerk on Court Street, when the lawyer himself went over within the hour, because a man like that has to see it with his own eyes, pulled the heavy book down and laid it open on the counter and ran her finger to the line and read the recording date out plain, 9 years and some months back, and stamped a certified copy and slid it across. And that was the end of the argument before it ever got to be one. There was no shouting. There was no scene worth the name. There was only a recorded date in a county book that had been sitting in plain sight the whole time the rest of them were laughing. And against a date in the book, there is nothing a raised voice can do. Dale Mercer had spent an inheritance he'd seized, and Brenda had spent the spending, and the Lake House went back on the market the next week with a sign in the yard, and the corner they had thrown at an orphan, like a joke, turned out to be the one thing in the whole estate worth keeping, and it had never for one day been theirs to throw. Carrie took the bonds in the slow, the way Opal had bought them, in no hurry. She paid the back taxes, and she had the condemned notice lifted off the door, and she kept the ledger going. The first new line she wrote in it under all of Opal's was for the free clinic down on Strother. The same one the old woman had carried through the winter the mill cut its insurance, and Carrie carried it through another, and a nurse turned a key in that door, one more cold morning because of a thing decided in a bakery the nurse would never see. And when a girl came through Marion that fall with a duffel, and no place, put out of a house the way Carrie had been put out, on Iron Street, with a porch light going dark behind her, Carrie did not send her on. She tied an apron on her and showed her the ovens and gave her a key on a string. They reopened on a winter evening when the dark came down early and blew over Main Street and the cold pressed in at the glass. The new sign over the door was small and plain and said only Opal's, gold on green, and Walt Sams had hung it himself off a ladder he was too old to be on. Inside, the brick floor was swept and warm and whole, the one loose brick mortared back down for good now over an empty steel pocket, and the ovens were going, and the windows of that long dark corner threw their light all the way across the sidewalk and into the street. The line ran out the door and down past the old depot, the whole worn town of it, come to stand in the cold for bread from the place they'd all walked across for 40 years and called ruined. The bell over the door rang and rang. Behind the glass, the ovens glowed and the light did not go out.